Ray Middleton here from Fulfilling Lives in England. In this film, we're going to interview Jay Levy from the United States and hear him describe some of his great innovative ideas that he's put together called Pretreatment. He's put these ideas together recently in a book that he's edited with Robin Johnson, who invented Psychologically Informed Environments, or PI, called Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness. If you're interested in these ideas, it might be worth considering getting hold of a copy of that book, where Robin Johnson in England describes psychologically informed environments, and Jay Levy describes his pre-treatment approach, and also John Connolly describes how he's applied that pre-treatment ideas in England in a homeless drop-in centre in London. Suzanne Quinney also has a chapter where she describes the appreciative inquiry approach. And I've also got a chapter in that book describing my approach to PI and a trauma-informed approach to PI in the northeast of England. So do get hold of a copy of that book if you're interested. So here's my interview with Jay describing pre-treatment. So hi, Jay, welcome.
Great to be here. Good to see you, Ray.
Yeah, and really pleased to have you here. And maybe just to start with, just say a little bit about your job you do in America.
Sure. So I work with Elliott CHS, that's Community Human Services, out in the U.S., out in Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I oversee several outreach teams. And what that means is we have both people who are experts from experience as well as master level staff that partner and go out and do outreach on the streets, in the woods, in shelters, and it's really relationship based work. We use a pre-treatment model, and at this point I oversee teams that go out to half of Massachusetts, so it's quite a large...
That's a big geographical area.
Yeah, a large geographical area that we cover. Hit soup kitchens as well, and the whole idea really of the work, it ranges from crisis work to just engagement and being there with the person and really understanding where they're at, connecting people to resources, counseling. So it's really a whole range of things that we do, including, of course, getting people housed. So just to say, in a nutshell, pre-treatment really is about, as you say, getting where people are at, being able to speak a common language. It's really focused on relationship building. So we think about things in terms of stages of engagement. Very important that we think about how we support transitions, whether it's to resources and services or just to a new idea. We really think a lot about safety in a pre-treatment approach. So a lot of what we do can be based on a crisis intervention kind of stance or a harm reduction or harm minimalization stance in working with the person. And we also think in terms of stages of change. So there's really a lot that goes into thinking about what pre-treatment is and how we go about helping people by using those principles of care and doing the work. But in particular, common language development is a very important aspect of it. And it's very much focused on connecting to a person's words, ideas, values, working off of their story, their narrative, and framing the offerings in a way that really reverberates in the person's world. There's a chap named Heidegger, philosopher. He says language is the house of being. And I like to think of the world and the work that we do in terms of different houses of language. And one house of language that is very, I think, important for us to get to know is the house of language of the client. So there's our house of language, there's the house of language of the client, and there's the many houses of language of resources and services. And the question is, how are we able to enter the house of language of the client or develop our own playground of language, kind of the playground between houses, where we can get a good dialogue going. And so this connects very much to the book, Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness, because we're constantly trying to find ways to cross cultural divides through productive dialogue. And that really means specifically connecting the people's words and ideas in a way that reverberates, that it really shows that we understand where they're coming from, and utilizing some of their language base toward the offerings that we make of help.
Could you illustrate it with an example?
Sure, yeah. So there's a chapter in the book that features Miguel, and there's a couple of things that goes on in that chapter. First of all, I meet Miguel, who's a Hispanic male. He's from Puerto Rico. He's out in this park in Boston, and he doesn't have anything for his feet. So culturally, he's from Puerto Rico, so he's used to walking on the rocks in Puerto Rico and the sand. But I wanted to offer him, something for his feet because the weather was getting colder. So we kind of just began with engagement and getting to know him. And initially I offered shoes, and we ended up kind of negotiating where he was open to getting sandals. And that was kind of a better fit for him in terms of where he was at. So he accepted sandals, and from there our relationship kind of blossomed. And we got to a point where we were talking about connecting him to mental health care, and brought up the option because he saw me as a counselor, and he was very connected to that, and he felt like it was really helping him to have a place to talk to somebody and to get perspective on the world and its situation. And slowly we built a common language around mental health, and that was a real important step toward trying to make that connection. So it was really picking up on the words that he uses to describe his mental health, and that included stress. It included, like, when he felt down, he had certain words that he used. It wouldn't be depression. It might not have been the clinical terms that we use. So it's important to reflect those kinds of words back. That's what sort of builds the playground of language that we can work off of. And at that point, I was able to kind of make the offering to him, and hopefully to do it again within his language base so it would really reverberate. And I thought that I had that connection and it was ready, like the time was right to make that offering. But what happened, to my surprise, is when I made the offering, I used the word therapist.
Yeah.
And he heard that word as the rapist, which is the way therapist is spelled.
Spells out, you split it up, yeah.
They split it up, so it says the rapist. And it really led to kind of his sense of let's say, his negative view of what therapy could be all about, which was, forcibly taking things like secrets from him or exposing him in a way where he'd be very vulnerable, and it'd be kind of a very aggressive process and not something that would be helpful at all. So somehow counselor resonated in a much more positive way, but therapist didn't resonate well at all. And to me, that's part of what I would call the cultural divide, even if it's on an individual level. It's just he's in a different place. He has a different sense of what these words mean. And so I needed to come back and first of all to understand that I offended him using that word, and to take a stance of being apologetic, which was important, to let him know and remind him about the work that we've done together and the things that he liked about counseling as opposed to therapy. Yeah. Imagine if I used the word psychotherapist. I mean, that would sound really, really difficult. So I was able to reframe things eventually with the word counselor and really connect it to, I offer counseling, and I know of someone who does some of this work similarly, but outside of a clinic that he can go over to and get some help. But then, part of this piece of developing what I call these pre-treatment pathways toward getting people the help that they need is you also need to then work with the clinic, and for them to understand that their resource base needs to develop a pathway that can reach out to the client. That's very important too. So I could take all that I've learned from Miguel and connect that with the person who would be my contact
in that service. And
service.
And does that involve understanding the house of language of that service? In this case, it's mental health services, but I guess it could be addiction services or housing or any kind of service that you're trying to bridge someone into?
Absolutely. And you can think of mental health services. Think of what people might go through when they go through an intake. So again, there's a cultural divide often. You might offer a mental health service. When the client gets there, they might hear words like, or sentences like, are you suicidal? What's your psychiatric history? They might hear some diagnoses being thrown around, like depression and schizophrenia and things like that. So the thing is, it's a whole house of language that service connects to. And when we try to place someone there, they're really entering a different world, a different house. And we have to prepare them to enter that house. So with Miguel, it was more than just the word therapist. It was helping him over time to actually have a working mental health vocabulary that made sense in his world, but then connecting with the people at the clinic and explaining to them the type of vocabulary we developed. So when Miguel went over, the people at the clinic could then work with him within the bounds of his vocabulary, reframe things in a way that it could resonate better and not turn them off to the offer.
So you're working in both places. You're working with the potential service and their house of language and the jargon maybe that's built up there, and helping them understand the person you're trying to bridge over. Exactly. But you're also working with the person, understanding how they see the world. And it made me think, there's a guy called Bakhtin. He says that when we use a word, we only ever own half of the word, because the other half belongs to the other person who interprets that word. So in the example of therapist, we might think we know what it means, but Miguel had a very different, strong, negative understanding of that word, and then you were able to kind of acknowledge that and repair the relationship, and then, but also then not just retreat, but find out that there were useful things about counselling that you found acceptable, and that so you didn't give up on the idea that you may bridge into a service that's helpful, but you're mindful of the different worlds of houses of language. Those worlds, is that, have I understood that?
You got that, yeah that's correct.
So thanks a lot, Jay.
Thank you, Ray, this was great.
Cheers.
Talk to you soon.